Welcome everybody in Pakhuis de Zwijger on this beautiful night in November in the ijszaal van Pakhuis de Zwijger with a beautiful crowd here. Thank you for being here on this special time in history, I guess, because, well, you all had to get a QR code to get in, and 1 minute ago the bar had to close. So luckily some of you realized that and bought a drink here to the stage. In the programming of the Pakhuis, we sometimes feel it's necessary to have a program where we only invite one person to the stage. And that is actually a rare phenomenon in this house, because normally we have like these dialogues with more than one person on the stage, but sometimes the person we invite has a message which we think should have all your attention. And that's why we invited this amazing political philosopher who wrote about being a good ancestor. So please join me in welcoming to the stage of Pakhuis de Zwijger, Roman Krznaric. Give him a big stage. And it's so funny because you have one of the few political philosophers, writers, who actually has given the people who are going to interview him a big service, because on your website, at the end, there is like this little voice clip, and you press it and you pronounce your own name, which is really funny, and then explain how you have to pronounce your name. But then suddenly I had this, oh fuck, I have to remember what he just said to me. So really funny, but thank you for that service.
Well, you just have to say every letter without fear, and yes, it should come out okay.
Yeah. So, but I realized now I have to be fearless, and then you start being, well, yeah, you start being fearful. Okay, so anyway, welcome to Amsterdam, and thank you so much for writing this beautiful book. His newest book on the history and future of long-term thinking, titled The Good Ancestor, a radical prescription for long-term thinking. And in Dutch it's called De Goede Voorouder. De Goede Voorouder, you can pronounce it. You have to pronounce everything.
De Goede Voorouder.
You're very good, without fear. And the book in Dutch will be sold by the publisher at the end of this event at 9:30. And the big question in the book, and also for tonight, is how can we be a good ancestor? What does that mean and entail, and what does it give as a prescription for life, actually? And we are with two kinds of crowd tonight. We have a crowd here in Pakhuis, live. Please make sure that everybody who's watching online knows it's really true. So give a big applause again. They can hear you. Yeah? Yeah. But we also are joined with some people who are watching this from home. And it's, of course, a big service because some people just cannot come because they're in quarantine or whatever. So also a welcome to you watching this evening from home. The coming hour we'll have an online session, and that means that after 1 hour we'll stop the recording of this session, and people who are watching at home are going to miss the last half hour, because then we give you, the audience here in Amsterdam Live, the opportunity to interact with our guests, ask questions, post your own thoughts, have a discussion with Roman. So please save your questions and comments for after 9 o'clock. But if you're at home and you think, but I miss it, and I have this very, very important question I have to ask Roman, you can use the Mentimeter. Use your phone, go to mentimeter.com or menti.com, enter code 6221-7204, 6221-7204, and then you can post your question, and I will receive the questions here on my screen. So that is our, well, service to the people who cannot be here in the room. But the fun thing is, at 9 o'clock, when the cameras are off, we will have this, well, nice Q&A, well, let's say show.
An adventurous conversation.
An adventurous
where we say things we've never said before.
Yeah, and the cameras are not there. Exactly, Roman. That is exactly the swear we are looking for. So, okay, let's start. And the evening is that you will start with a presentation where you give like the broad outline of your thinking. And after that, we will have a conversation where I will include the comments by Mentimeter. And if you are here in the room, you think, let's be smart and also use this Mentimeter, of course, I will not check whether it's from my home or here in the room, so feel free if you really want to do that. Okay, but so let's start by giving you the floor for your presentation. And explicitly you said, please, Natasha, leave the stage, because that makes it much more easy for me to have like this stage for my presentation. So give him again a warm welcome, Roman Krznaric.
It's 3:23 in the morning, and I'm awake because my great-great-grandchildren won't let me sleep. My great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do when the planet was plundered? What did you do while the earth was unraveling? Those are words not by me, but by a poet called Drew Dellinger, from a poem of his called Hieroglyphic Stairway. And when I first heard them, they pierced my heart. And they also inspired me and my partner to do something a little bit unusual. At the end of 2019, during the last UK general election, we decided to give our children our votes. So we all sat around the kitchen table and we discussed all the different party platforms and how the electoral system worked. And they then told us where to put the mark, the X, on the ballot paper. And in case you're wondering, one of them voted how we would and the other one went in a different direction, but that was okay. Now, why did we do this? Well, Drew Dellinger, that poet, really understood it, because it's all about the fact that we live in a world that doesn't represent the interests of the generation upon generation of human beings who will inhabit the future. And this matters, I think, because we live in an age of chronic short-term thinking, that we know our politicians can't see past the next election, or even the latest tweet, or even form a government in some countries. And we know our businesses can't see past the quarterly report, that nations sit around international conference tables arguing with each other while the planet burns and species disappear, as we've recently seen in the COP26 climate negotiations in Glasgow. And of course, as individuals, we're looking at our phones and clicking the buy now button. This is the age, the tyranny of the now. And I think it's clear we need long-term thinking to deal with multiple challenges facing humanity in the 21st century. We need to be planning for the next pandemic that might be on the horizon, or planning for the risks from new technologies like artificial intelligence and synthetic biology. We need to be dealing with racial injustice and wealth inequality, which get passed on from generation to generation, embedded in criminal justice institutions and in public culture more generally. And of course, we need more long-term thinking to deal with the global ecological crisis, which is here right now. The wildfires are in California right now. The droughts are in Kenya right now, but we know it's only going to get worse and worse and worse. And the way I think about this problem is that I believe we have colonized the future, that we treat the future like a distant colonial outpost where we can freely dump ecological degradation and technological risk as if there was nobody there. And the tragedy, of course, is that all those future generations who are there can't do anything about this pillaging of their inheritance. They're given no political rights or representation. They have no influence in the marketplace. And I think it's quite well represented, this issue, by this cartoon, which talks about the fact that that's the crap we inherited, that's our crap, and we'll let the grandkids sort it out, whether it's toxic waste and climate change or the colonial racism and debt and all these different kinds of things. That's where we are. And it's quite difficult, though, I think, to grasp the scale of this problem. And you can think about it this way, that I think of it as the scale of unborn generations, that there are 7.7 billion of us alive today. And over the last 50,000 years, let's get really long-term here, an estimated nearly 100 billion people have been born and died. But going forward in time, over the next 50,000 years, assuming current birth rates level off and stabilize, nearly 7 trillion people will be born. There they are in that giant orange circle. In the next 2 centuries alone, tens of billions of people will be born. Amongst them all your children and grandchildren, if you have them, and their grandchildren and the friends and communities on whom they will depend. So there's a real question there, right, of how will those future generations remember us for what we did or didn't do when we had the chance? They speak to us sometimes in our dreams, but often we don't hear them. Now, someone who really thought about this issue a lot was the great immunologist Jonas Salk, who developed the first polio vaccine back in the 1950s. And he said the great question facing our society is this: are we being good ancestors? In other words, how are we going to be remembered by those generations to come? And he believed that if we're going to be remembered well, and if we were going to tackle the long-term challenges of our time, like the destruction of the living world, we'd need to extend our time horizons. So instead of thinking on a scale of seconds, minutes, and hours, we need to think on a scale of decades, centuries, and even millennia. And when I look around the world, I'm inspired by the fact that there are a huge number of movements and organizations which are starting to embody this idea of being a good ancestor. I think of them as time rebels dedicated to long-term thinking. And you might think of examples you might know about yourself, but here are a couple I find inspiring. One of them is the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is collecting millions of seeds in an indestructible rock bunker in the Arctic Circle that's designed to last for 1,000 years. It's like a botanical Noah's Ark protecting the world's plant biodiversity. But if you thought 1,000 years was quite a long time, well, how about 10,000 years? This is the 10,000-year clock, a slow time clock being currently built as we speak inside a limestone mountain in the Texas desert. It's designed to stay accurate for 10 millennia. And you'll be able to visit it by walking through the desert, hiking for a couple of days, walking up steps of the mountainside, each of them at the value of 1 million years of geological time, and visit this kind of secular altarpiece for a long now civilization. The idea is to give us a sense of responsibility for all those generations to come. Now, you might look at those and think, well, you know, they're not part of our everyday lives. Look, we're looking at our phones, we're going shopping, we're dealing with the here and now. How do we really become long-term thinkers in our own lives, in our businesses, organizations, and society as a whole? Well, in my book, I talk about this idea that there's a tug of war for time going on, a struggle between 6 drivers of short-termism in society and 6 drivers of long-term thinking. Many of the drivers of short-termism are very familiar, like digital distraction or the short-termism of political cycles. Some of them are older ones, like the tyranny of the clock, the fact that clock time for 500 years has been speeding up our lives and shortening the future. The first mechanical clocks used to chime maybe once every hour. By 1700, most clocks had minute hands. By 1800, they had second hands. The clock became the key machine of the Industrial Revolution. Of course, now we've got nanosecond speed share trading. So we need to get over those short-term drivers. And to do that, we need these 6 ways to think long-term, which are kind of like a mental toolkit for becoming a good ancestor, becoming a long-term thinker. And I want to just talk about 3 of them very briefly. One of them is the idea of cathedral thinking. And that's the idea of embarking on projects with very long time horizons, lasting decades, maybe even centuries. So Greta Thunberg, of course, has said we need cathedral thinking to deal with the ecological crisis. And cathedral thinking comes in different varieties. So one variety is a kind of cathedral thinking which is about embarking on projects which take a really, really long time to complete. So St. John's Cathedral in Den Bosch, you can see there, it took over 300 years to complete. Started in the 1220s, wasn't finished until the 1550s. So that's a classic cathedral thinking project. Now, next to that, you've got what might think of as a sewer thinking project rather than cathedral thinking. Those are the sewers that were built in London in the 1860s and 1870s after a famous event called the Great Stink of 1858, where raw sewage had been dumped in the Thames year after year. Tens of thousands of people were dying from cholera each year. And when the smell was so bad, it actually went into the Houses of Parliament. Members of Parliament couldn't breathe, and they were wearing masks, like they should be wearing today. And they finally passed the crisis emergency legislation to build the sewers. And the guy who was the chief engineer at the top right-hand corner in a top hat, Sir Joseph Bazalgette, he decided to make the sewers twice as big as they needed to be for the population at the time and use very expensive, long-lasting bricks and cement. And that's why those sewers are still in use today. If you walk down the River Thames, you're walking on the sewers from the 19th century. That's a kind of cathedral thinking, not a project which took a long time to complete, but was designed to last a long time once it started. And that probably resonates with the whole history of dike building and polders and the waterboards and so on in the Netherlands going back to the 16th century, or maybe not. And then the third kind of cathedral thinking is to recognize that social movements can also be cathedral thinkers. Most social movements don't achieve their aims in just months or years. They often actually take half a century, like the civil rights movement in the United States, the movements for women's votes in many countries, movements for indigenous rights today, for example. So there's all these kinds of cathedral thinking, which on one level are very inspiring, but in some ways they're very limiting because cathedral thinking can be put towards very narrow and self-serving ends, like the regime in North Korea wants to survive for generation upon generation, or in corporations, a former head of Goldman Sachs, Gus Levy, once said, "We're greedy, but long-term greedy, not short-term greedy." Well, that's not good enough in my view. That's not being a good ancestor. So we need more than cathedral thinking. We also need intergenerational justice. Now, the great comedian Groucho Marx once said, "Why should I care about future generations? What have they ever done for me?" Right? And often we feel that, right? Look, I've got enough stuff going on in my life. Why should I care about those people far away? And I think we can find inspiration to do that in indigenous ideas of ecological stewardship, the idea that we inherit the earth and we pass it on, ideally better than we found it. And I think it's really well expressed in the idea of seventh generation decision-making found in many Native American communities and elsewhere. And here's a beautiful quote, I think, from Chief Oren Lyons from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, or the Iroquois as they used to be known. He said this, he said, "We're looking ahead as is one of the first mandates given us as chiefs to make sure every decision that we make relates to the welfare and the well-being of the seventh generation to come. And that is the basis by which we make decisions in council. Will this be to the benefit of the seventh generation?" Now you might look at that and think, well, that's a very lovely idea, but how do we put that into practice in a modern city, in Amsterdam, in Shanghai, in Dubai, in Miami? Well, there's some really inspiring organizations around the world taking this seventh generation idea and trying to make it practical in their own respectful way. One of them is a movement in Japan called Future Design. And it's a local government decision-making model, participatory kind of citizen assembly idea, where they invite local people to discuss and draw up plans for the towns and cities where they live. Directly inspired by the Native American seventh generation idea, and they typically divide people into two groups. Half are told that they're residents from the present day, and the other half are given these beautiful orange ceremonial robes to wear, and I happen to have brought mine along today with me. So this is my very precious robe from the small town of Yahaba, population 30,000, northern Japan. So the residents, half of them are just told they're residents from the present day. Half of them are given these robes and told to imagine themselves as residents from the year 2060. And it turns out the residents from 2060, many studies have been done of this, systematically advocate far more transformative plans for their towns and cities, whether it's long-term investment in healthcare and education or action on climate change. Future designs are now being used in big cities like Kyoto, Japan's Ministry of Finance, companies like Fujitsu in sustainability planning. And you can imagine that every town and city in the Netherlands could invent its own gown and bring this kind of decision-making into its long-term planning and strategizing. But there's another movement inspired by Native American seventh generation ideas, and that's a legal movement in the United States to give rights to future generations. The 21 young people you can see there are suing the US federal government, and they're arguing for and campaigning for the right to a safe climate and healthy atmosphere for both current and future generations. And this growing global movement for future generations' rights, I think, is one of the most exciting developments in the history of human rights since the French Revolution. The Netherlands is playing its part, of course, with the agenda case. There are other cases like that in Germany, in Pakistan, in Colombia. So there's really a huge amount of energy in this legal area of trying to give these rights to future people, to try and get governments to stop subsidizing the fossil fuel industry, for example. So there's a lot of action around intergenerational justice. But finally, let me just say something about developing a legacy mindset. This is about really thinking about how we're going to be remembered by the generations to come. And to be a long-term thinker, I think, is about looking backwards as much as forwards. We need to think about what we have inherited from the past, that we have inherited, in many ways, very positive things from previous generations. You know, the cities that we live in, or medical discoveries like Salk's polio vaccine, but we're also the inheritors of very negative legacies, right? Legacies of, you know, economies that are structurally addicted to fossil fuels and endless growth. Legacies of societies which have been inherited the vestiges of colonialism and racism and slavery, which must now be repaired. So we need to think about, well, what are we going to take from the past and pass on, and which bits are we going to kind of leave behind? And I think to do that, we need to think about how we might connect ourselves in a way emotionally with future generations. The rational is not enough here. And to do that, to make that more emotional connection, I'd like you to do something for me. We're going to do a little imaginative thought exercise called human layers. And to do that, you will need to put down your beers and stand up for me, please. Okay, now what I'd like you to do is to pick up that beer that fell over, which I could just hear. What I'd like you to do is just to close your eyes for a moment. Just take a deep breath. And I want you to imagine, with your eyes closed, the face of a young person in your life who you really care about. It could be a nephew or niece or your own child or grandchild. Just picture their face for a moment. And now I'd like you to take a tiny step forward. Still with your eyes shut, you've now traveled 30 years into the future. Again, picture that child's face now 30 years on. What do they look like? What's the sound of their voice? What joys are there in their life, and what struggles might they be facing? Hold that thought for a moment. And now take a final small step forward. It's now their 90th birthday party. They're 90 years old and surrounded by family and friends and loved ones and old work colleagues. Go and have a look out the window. What kind of world do you see out there? And now come back in and you notice this 90-year-old stands up on their cane, about to give a birthday speech, and suddenly they see a photograph of you, their departed dead ancestor, over on the table. And instead of giving the birthday speech, they decide to tell the gathered room about something that you did to benefit their generation, some act that you did to be a good ancestor. Just think now for a moment about what they said about you, their departed ancestor. And now just slowly open your eyes again and come back into the present, and please take your seats. The first time I did that exercise, I found it incredibly confronting, as some of you might have done too, depending on what you see out the window. But one of the things that happened to me when I did that is I was imagining my daughter, who you met earlier, as a 90-year-old. And one of the things I realized was that You know, she could well be alive in the year 2100. The future isn't science fiction. It's an intimate family fact. And what I realized was that she wasn't alone in the future. She was part of the web of human relationships and community she was part of, but also part of the web of the living world, the air she breathed and the water she drank. So what I learned was that if I care about her life, I need to care about all life. In other words, there's a bridge between something very personal and family-oriented almost to something much more transcendent or universal, a care for the future holders, the universal strangers of tomorrow. And as you hold your thoughts there, let me just show you finally one project which I find really inspiring, which I think embodies the idea of the legacy mindset very well. It's a 100-year art project from the Scottish artist Katie Patterson called Future Library, where every year for 100 years, a famous writer is donating a book which will remain completely secret and unread until the year 2114, when the 100 books will be printed on paper made from 1,000 trees which are planted in a forest outside Oslo. Now, the first person to donate a book was the Canadian author Margaret Atwood. Many other authors have donated books since. And just think, Margaret Atwood will never see that book, that novel published in her lifetime. She'll never meet any of the readers. It's a legacy gift to the future. And really, that's what I want to leave you with now, to just ask yourself, what is the legacy gift that I want to leave for future generations? Thank you very much.
Yeah. My daughter will be 90 in 2100.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's an amazing thought, isn't it? It's just not that far away, that future.
Not at all. And it's interesting because we actually had a speech from a person from the youth climate movement. We also have a representative tonight. And he gave a speech and he was constantly talking to us, adults in their 40s who are completely like addicted to the now. You're addicted to the now. And he was saying he has they have started a project of to get into boardrooms and imagine 2100 all the time. What is the effect of every decision you take now on the lives of everybody in 2100? And they are doing that. So interesting.
Yeah, in fact, in the UK,
inspired by this, by your work.
Right. Well, there's a renewable energy company in the UK called Good Energy, where they've just started a children's board. So they have a youth board that's supposed to hold the main board to account. Now, they don't have much power, but it's about changing the culture, right? It's about like thinking about 2100.
Yeah. There's also a Dutch a beautiful a former politician, but also a children's writer, and Jan Terlouw. And he introduced...
I met him yesterday.
Yeah, oh yeah, and he has introduced the future chair. So an empty chair in every room where you imagine the future to be seated.
Yeah, so you have the chair, or you can burn a candle.
Yeah, exactly.
For future generations. Yeah. Lots of ways to do it.
Mm. In your book, you want us to start realizing that shortism is the way we are actually living our lives, and that we should try to become long-term thinkers, right? But you in your book you make an analysis of the brain, and why is it so inherent to human action that we most of the times are focusing on short term? What can you explain to the audience? What kind of brains do we have that actually make us do that?
I have our brains in my pocket.
Exactly. Oh, you're so like your wife. She always has props also, Kate Rayworth. She always brings props to the stage.
We spend a lot of time talking about sexy props. Well, here are my props.
It's okay.
A marshmallow.
Okay, Natasha, is it okay to bring my props? Yes, Kate, but now you have props.
I didn't even ask you for permission, but
No.
Look, I have here a marshmallow and an acorn. And so just as I said, there's a tug of war going on in time between drivers of short-termism and long-termism. There's also a tug of war going on in our brains between the marshmallow brain and the acorn brain. And the marshmallow brain is the bit which, you know, we all know we have. It's the bit that focuses on short-term rewards and instant gratification. You know, that's clicking the buy now button, getting that dopamine rush. It was named after the famous marshmallow psychology test in the 60s, where kids had the marshmallow put in front of them. If they could resist eating for 15 minutes, they were rewarded with 2 marshmallows, and they snatched the snack, most of them.
most would snack the snack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But one of the things missing from those studies, and many things are problems with that marshmallow study, but one of them is that it doesn't really take into account the fact that we have this acorn brain that here in our frontal lobe, particularly a part called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, if you like that neuroscience stuff, that's the bit which is all about long-term planning and strategizing and thinking. And we're better at this than most other creatures. It's a new part of the brain. It's only 2 million years old, whereas the marshmallow brain's 80 million years old. But look, just think about the fact that other creatures do plan a bit, like a chimpanzee will get a stick, strip off the leaves and turn it into a tool to poke into a termite hole, but they'll never make a dozen of those tools and set them aside for next week. But that's what human beings do, right? We're experts at the temporal pirouette. Our minds can dance across time. One moment you can be looking at your phone, and the next moment you're writing the song list for your own funeral. You know, that's how we, you know, it's the acorn brain which enabled us to voyage into space and built the Great Wall of China. Haven't you got a song list for your own funeral? I bet you have.
No, I was like, oh my God, I have to do that on my,
Come on.
That on my to-do list.
Yeah. So, you know, we need to create a world which switches on the acorn brain and puts that little marshmallow brain, which, you know, has its place.
And how do you do that?
How do you do that?
Because, of course, you get like these anecdotes that we are, well, mammals who are trained to look for food immediately, instant gratification. We need to make sure in the now we are fed and stuff like that. So that short-termism is part of survival thinking. So how can you switch that innate, older brain and switch to the newer brain?
Well, because you were making fun of my props, I'm going to bring out another prop.
No, it's
just to punish you, okay? It's my nail file.
Oh, very good.
Okay? Which all long-term thinking men should always have with them.
Also, if you think about the short time, I would say, but okay.
But maybe.
Yeah.
So the reason I've got this nail file here is because this is actually my symbol about deep time.
Exactly.
The fact that humankind is just an eye blink in the great cosmic story. We have been here just for a moment. And to really become a long-term thinker, to switch on the acorn brain one way, just one way, is to recognize, to really get a sense of that fact that we are just that eye blink in the cosmic story, but it's quite hard to do that. So the way I think about it is this, is that if the age of the Earth was the distance from the tip of your nose to the end of your outstretched middle finger, then one stroke with a nail file erases human history. It's gone, okay? And that might make you think, well, look, if it's that short, I should just do anything and fly wherever or whatever. But actually, the way I think about it, and I think most people who start engaging with deep time think about it, is that it makes you realize, like, it raises an existential question in a sense, like, who are we to have wrought such destruction on the world with our ecological damage and technological impacts? You know, in just 200 years, you know, we have, you know, in really just an eye blink, what have we done? And what right have we got to do that? And I think a bit of that perspective I call deep time humility can help us on the road to switching on that acorn brain.
Yeah, a deep realization of humility, of what is the justification of acting, having so much impact while we have like only a little bit of this Earth history is part of our history. Beautiful. In the Netherlands, we have a movement which are actually, I would say, our own time rebels, as you will call them in your book. It's grootouders voor het klimaat, grandparents for the climate. And Hans van Dijk is here, and we have invited them because we have one guest on stage, but we couldn't, of course, resist. So we invited them, our own time rebels, we thought, to pose a question or give a comment. Please, give him a warm welcome in Pakhuis.
Thank you. Well, and thank you for having us here. And thank Roman for your excellent book. And look, I really read it. And I
You sure you didn't put those in just at the last moment? But
you want a nasty question?
No, I want a very nice, gentle question from the grandparents of the Netherlands.
And I'm not a grandparent
Yet.
but I'm a
you're
senior.
part of the movement.
I'm part of the movement, and I'm a senior citizen. And we, as organization, feel responsible for the things we leave behind, and we try to think about the future. Yes, this is my Eucosia, by the way. This is from Eucosia, this sweater, and they all invite you to go to Eucosia and buy stuff there. And it's also a browser, so I use Eucosia for my browser. And the little contribution.
Do you have a question?
I have a question. Yeah. I slow read this book, and on page 99, you're optimistic about whether we are able to get people to join the movement and to make a difference. I'm hesitant in that sense. And how do we get the people off their sugar rush? How do we get the people in the middle, the people between the climate activists and the radical right that we suffer from these days again in the Netherlands as well? How do we get the people in the middle to be convinced to do the good thing, so to say, to be ethically responsible for what they leave behind?
It's an incredibly difficult and really profound question. It's the question of how does social change happen, in a way. And all I can say is what I try to do, or how I try to do it myself, in a sense. So, for instance, when I'm talking to, say, politicians, they're not necessarily people in the middle, but just let me start there. When I'm talking to politicians, members of parliament, for example, in various countries about the ideas I've written about, I always start by talking about children and grandchildren and legacies and inheritances and the idea of being a good ancestor, because nobody disagrees with the idea of being a good ancestor, whether they're on the left or the right or in the middle. But I found that this is a conversation starter about what does it mean to be a good ancestor to you. I've talked about that with refugees, with indigenous peoples, with school children, with people from lots of different social backgrounds, and everyone has different ideas of what it means to be a good ancestor. But I believe that one of the ways we change the world is one conversation at a time. And I think we need new public conversations. We need like menus of conversations on the tables of every restaurant in Amsterdam and elsewhere, asking questions like, what legacy do you want to leave for your family, for your community, and for the living world? Now, that might not sound very practical, but you know, it's very different from starting a movement where everyone's wearing, you know, jackets like this. But I think those conversations are really fundamental. I also believe, actually, we're not going to get all of the change necessarily from the people in the middle. I think that, particularly following the COP26 climate negotiations, which I think are a historically shameful dereliction of duty to humankind, that we need more political disruption on the streets, more breaking of the rules. And I say that as a historian of social movements, a recognition that most of the most influential global movements in the last century have often broken rules. The movement for women's suffrage in Britain in the early 20th century, the civil rights movement in the United States in the 1960s, you know, the movement for rights of independence in India. And I think that's where we are today. And not everybody wants to do that, and I understand that. Not everyone wants to go onto the street and block a road. I do it. I don't want to do it. Right? I don't want to necessarily be part of an Extinction Rebellion occupying the streets movement, but I do it because I see that all those political and legal and other economic approaches have their place, but we also need something more. And when I've seen parents and grandparents on the streets at those protests with a little medallion or picture of their grandchild or child around them, I find it incredibly moving and incredibly powerful, and I think we all should.
Yeah, there was a big climate march, of course, here in the Netherlands, historically the biggest in our small history of climate marches. But anyway, there were many people who were wearing actually a picture of their children or grandchildren in that march.
And actually, I met someone yesterday who doesn't have children or want children, but what he does, he's got this, he wears a pair of shoes around his neck, tiny little shoes, which is spray painted silver as a kind of a symbol.
I saw
of all these generations.
Yeah. So if you talk to these politicians, because they invite you because they are inspired by your thinking. No, don't be surprised. It's a very inspiring book. If you haven't read it, please read it, because it actually gives you the ideas of turning a conversation into a real conversation. So that is amazing. But what is the answer? So what do you see if the effects of changing the conversation with these, for instance, politicians?
Well, in a very practical sense, like in Wales, not far from where I live, they have a new political position. They've only had it around for 5 years. It's called the Future Generations Commissioner. It's a non-party political position. And the job of the Future Generations Commissioner is to look at the impact of public policy up to 30 years ahead, whether it's in the area of transport or education or healthcare, environment, or wherever. I'm part of a campaign for the whole of the United Kingdom to have a Future Generations Commission or Commissioner, something similar. And I helped draft the legislation, the bill. It will probably get crushed by the current government, but we are fighting hard to have that and to have a citizen jury or citizen assembly element of part of that. And I guess the question I'd ask to all of you here today and online is, well, does the Netherlands have a Future Generations Commissioner or a Future Generations Ombudsman or a Minister for the Future? Not as far as I know. Could it have? Should it have? Might it be possible? I don't know enough about the politics of your country, but these are the kind of practical things that can be done, and this stuff is spreading to other countries.
Yeah. So your idea is, or central in your ideas is, of course, to actually imagine. I mean, we just did it in the exercise. Imagine yourself standing in the shoes of somebody who's 19 years old. So I was wondering also, because you mentioned the very dreadful results of Glasgow, the COP. What is in your thinking the use of putting short-termism in the goals of, for instance, climate change? I mean, what we should achieve in 2030, what we should achieve in 2050. How do you reflect on that with the thinking of the good ancestor?
Well, I guess one of the ways I think about this is I think about the way that is on the level of the individual in our own lives, we often make immediate decisions with huge consequences. Like we might decide to have children, for example.
Yeah.
I had twins, so...
You didn't choose that, that just happened.
And it just happened. But we did decide to have children, you know, and that kind of thing. And what I'm trying to say is that, look, a society can recognize that there are actions we take that have very long-term consequences, but there's an incredible urgency or immediacy around them. And it is absolutely urgent that we actually, you know, decarbonize much, much faster than most politicians and international institutions are asking us to do. And that means having short-term targets, but it's all about the long-term impact. Of course, it helps current generations. It also helps future generations, because otherwise we will just keep kicking the can down the road to the next decade and the next decade and so on.
Yeah, so for long-term thinking, you can imagine to have short-term goals.
Yeah, and this is going to help us to escape what the great American science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson called. He called the period, he wrote a book based in the 24th century called 2312, and he looked back at our period between 2005 and 2060. He called it the Great Dithering, which I think in Dutch, excuse my Dutch, is something like het grote getreusel, or something like that. Treuzeltijd.
Impressive.
Right? So we're in this period of Treuzeltijd, you know, this dithering, you know, but we need that short-term energy to get beyond it.
Yeah, so it's not a plea to stop thinking in the short run. I mean, it's a plea to actually balance acting in the now, but also thinking of the consequences.
Yeah, one of the ways I think about it is that it's about bringing the voices of generations from to the now, and also generations from the past, and let's all have the conversation together. Yeah,
because I was imagining 7 generations back, when I was reading your book, but also preparing for tonight, and I was like, oh, that's only 1815. when 7 generations back, my great-grandfathers and mothers were living here and actually, I know what they were doing. We have this, and actually, if you walk through Amsterdam, it probably looked a bit like that in the beginning of the 19th century already. It isn't that far away. If you can imagine that, you can also imagine going forward 7 generations. So it was an interesting thought experiment. I thought, so we have many buildings in Amsterdam which are from that period. So it's actually here. 7 generations, what they did 7 generations
But
back.
it may not be here in 2300. I was looking at a map of the Netherlands in the year 2300, when the Delta program has failed in the middle of the 22nd century, and Amsterdam is a little island. You know, and this country's become a province of Germany, probably. You know.
Well, it's actually
Is
almost.
that a bit scary?
It's almost actually really gone.
Yeah.
So it's like Atlantis. It's like under the sea level. Yeah. Okay. Anyway, scary thinking. Yeah. But it's. I mean, you are a very humorous person, but it's a very serious message. I mean, it started from worrying. I mean, with the anecdote where you started your presentation, which cited the poem, you could have a nightmare if you imagine what kind of conversation you have with your great-great-great-grandchildren about what you're actually doing at the moment to actually help them have a fruitful life in a few generations. It's quite a very serious message that we really have to do this.
I mean, I'm a great believer in using the whole sort of smorgasbord of human emotions to motivate us. I believe in hope, yes, and you know, most of my friends from the climate movement say we always need to talk about hope. We need a positive message all the time because that's what energizes movements, and that's true. But I think we also need anger and despair and panic, as Greta's talked about. Yeah. You know, we're very complex creatures and different things work for different people. I actually am quite motivated by nightmarish visions of society. Yeah. You know, I watch Blade Runner 2049 and think, no, don't want that, you know, and that's motivating. I don't want to just see perfect, you know, photoshopped versions of the world in the year 2100 where there's, you know, everything's electric and everything's green and everything's perfect. It doesn't have the texture, you know, I can't feel it in my bones. Yeah. But I think we need all of that.
Yeah. And the balance in the book is beautiful. So it's frightening, but for me, that is reading about climate change, of biodiversity loss, and the books about that. They are frightening on the one hand, and on the other hand, you also present these fantastic time rebels. People are actually doing something in creating a different awareness, which hopefully will change the mindset of the planet.
Yeah, and you know, in my books, I always try and not paint utopian pictures, but I try and give lots of examples of real things. Yeah. They might be on quite a small scale sometimes, like future design, this Japanese movement. You know, it hasn't yet taken over the world, and it probably never will. But I see it spreading.
It's a nice inspirational form.
Yeah, and I see people being creative with it. It's sort of this idea of kind of peer-to-peer inspiration, and people can copy each other. In a sense, but be creative around the way they do it. And then you can think about your own ways that you want to bring this kind of thinking into your life. So, for instance, when I turned 50 some months ago, I ordered my children and my partner to go on a special birthday picnic. And the picnic I wanted to have was in a 900-year-old tree. So we actually went to this tree, about a 10-minute bike ride away. Sorry, don't laugh at my tree picnic birthday extravaganza, which I loved. And
no, it's about the phrase, I had to order my kids. That was
it was wintertime. I have the same birthday as Joseph Stalin, December the 21st. And But we went to the tree, and this is a 900-year-old yew tree in a churchyard, and we went and had a picnic up in the tree. Beautiful. And we talked about the fact that this tree had seen the Black Death in the 14th century and the English Civil War in the 17th century.
Great conversations for a
yeah, I think my kids, well, they're kind of used to hearing that from me and my partner, Kate, this kind of stuff. But, you know, they were actually quite amused, my kids, that the idea that I would want my ashes, you know, be burnt and then put into the base of this tree, into the tree roots. Yeah. And they thought that was lovely, but kind of also funny in a way. Yeah. But, you know, these are the ways we start creating new rituals in society and make them personal, you know, too.
Beautiful. In your presentation, you showed your children, which you actually gave your votes. Because if you're pleased that future generations have to be involved or have to be taken into account in current decision making, of course, the future generation, which will be voting citizens, are already among us, our children, the young people of this earth. What kind of role should they have? Are you inviting us all to, if you have children, to let them choose what kind of vote you what you would vote? Or how can we actually think of that? I mean, giving these young people a role in decision making.
I think that phrase, giving young people a role in decision making, is a more important phrase than giving children your vote. Yeah. And the reason I think that is because on some level, giving our children our votes in that election, and we've done it again in local municipal elections too, it's a kind of symbolic act, because I have gone and tried to look at the evidence around this. I used to be a political scientist at some point in my past, back in the 1990s, and I started looking at the evidence. Is it actually true that if you, say, lowered the voting age, you know, like in many countries now have voting age of 16 rather than 18, does it actually change outcomes? And as far as I can see, it doesn't really change outcomes generally, because you might be able to vote when you're 16, but the politicians are the same kinds of people. The corporate funding that controls politics is the same kind of thing. The short-term drivers are the same. And so actually, while I do believe in lowering the voting age, I also believe it's really important for young people to be involved in other areas of decision-making. So the idea of citizens' assemblies, young people should be involved in those kinds of mechanisms particularly. I think there's a huge space for it there, or like I mentioned, that company that has a children's board. So it's about trying to be creative about young people's participation. Why weren't there teenagers, young people, sitting at COP26 at the climate negotiations? You know, it would have totally changed the dynamic. And I thought it would have been quite good if it was also in a giant cathedral, like the one in Den Bosch, for example. Why not? Why in a sort of modern, featureless conference center, but actually somewhere that embodies the idea of thinking beyond the domination of the present tense?
Yeah, being completely addicted to the now. I mean, it's like how do you say that? It's without any character. It's a characterless environment. Yeah, I agree. We also invited somebody else, a representative of a time rebel. I would say time rebel. It's a nice word. It's Aniek Mone of the Dutch Youth Climate Movement. In the Netherlands, we would say Jonge Klimaatbeweging. Young people who are actually organizing themselves to have a voice in the climate discussions in this country. And also Aniek prepared a question. Can I invite you to the stage? Give her a warm welcome.
Yes, thank you. I love hearing you talk, Roman. I saw you yesterday, as we already discussed, and I keep realizing how boring my childhood was. I never had lunch in a tree, but
I'm not sure my kids would kind of agree with how wonderful it is to have picnics in trees, but
I guess we could still do these things. That's fine.
Tomorrow you can do it.
Yeah, I'm going to find a 900-year-old tree and have lunch in it. So I prepared a question for you, as I was asked, and it is that I realized that whenever we talk about future generations, we kind of seem to assume that future generations are this homogenous group of people. Well, they obviously are not. So how do you think we should take into account the diversity of interests that this group has? And maybe a little bit more difficult of a question, how do we deal with interests that we might not yet be aware of?
Okay, brilliant question. So, you know when I mentioned that idea that in Wales, that they've got this Future Generations commissioner. Well, I was telling my daughter about it, and she said, well, I don't like that idea of a commissioner, because what does that commissioner know about me or about my friends and people who are from really different backgrounds and different cultures and religions? It's kind of like Plato's idea of the kind of guardian who is a sort of an all-knowing kind of God, wise God that knows all about us. And so I'm actually not in favor of the idea of a single commissioner, for the very reason that I think you're getting at partly, which is that there are so many different kinds of futures for different kinds of people, so that we need to have things like citizens' assemblies to register, to represent the plurality of voices. And I think another really important aspect of this is the way that we colonize the future is very differentiated. In other words, that for particularly, it's the global north which has historically and continues to colonize the global south. So there's a great US lawyer called Philip Alston, who used to be the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights and Extreme Poverty. And he talked about this idea of climate apartheid. This phrase, climate apartheid, in one of his reports.
The most famous Dutch word, you know, apartheid.
Right, okay. Yeah, one of the Dutch's gift, the Netherlands' gift to the world, perhaps?
Exactly.
Or not. Yeah. So apartheid. So climate apartheid, he coined this term after Hurricane Sandy hit New York City in 2012, because he realized that, well, there was a kind of apartheid going on, because Goldman Sachs' building was fine. They had their own generator and 10,000 sandbags. But 500,000 quite poor New Yorkers, mostly people from marginalized communities of color, had no water or electricity or healthcare. So I think it's absolutely vital that the way we think about the future recognizes these differences. And then the second part of the question about the things that we don't know are sort of coming our way. What do we do about those? I don't know. And going back to Blade Runner 2049 again, look, I don't know if the year 2049 will be like Blade Runner 2049, and therefore it's quite difficult to prepare and plan for things, particularly in the realm of technological change. But when it comes to ecology, we know a hell of a lot about what the future is going to be like. You just have to open an IPCC report and know that we're going to be hitting 1 to 2 meters of sea level rises and 3-4 degrees of heating, probably by 2100. We don't know exactly how much it's going to be, but we know more than at any moment in history about where it's going to be going. And that means we know what to do in particular realms of action, where there's a common denominator, where whoever's alive in 2100 probably needs, at base, a lot of the same stuff that we need, that water to drink, the air to breathe, all of those kinds of things. So often I think when people talk about uncertainty, it's an excuse for apathy. It's like saying, well, I don't know what future's coming, so I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to plan at all. But actually, we know what's coming. We know a lot of what's coming. Not everything, but at least a big part of the picture.
Yeah. Yeah, and in your book you also show these trends, and to actually counter a trend towards to go down, you need a lot of efforts. Because the trends are all going in that direction, and they are going in that direction if we do not radically change. So you have explained the importance of knowledge. You have explained the importance of conversation, changing the conversation, and even gave us a little bit. There's also a question from the audience: what role mindfulness, being in the here and now, can play. You showed with that small exercise where you can use that, but maybe that's a nice way. You also use those kinds of methods, actually. Mindfulness, it's a question from the audience. What role can it play? And the last I would like to ask is, because then we have knowledge, we have conversation, we have perhaps imagination, but also the role of arts and music in actually to get from a balanced way of balancing shortism with long-term thinking. So first the idea of mindfulness, and then maybe the role of art and music in getting there.
So I have very mixed views about mindfulness.
Yeah.
I once did an event with a French Buddhist monk, Matthieu Ricard, about mindfulness. I said, what do you think of the new sort of rise of the mindfulness movement. This was a few years ago. He said, well, actually, I'm a bit worried about it. He said, because you could have a mindful psychopath or a mindful sniper who is just focused on being in the here and now and doing everything and not thinking of everything else and being totally focused. And he was kind of joking, but he was also making a serious point about the fact that so much mindfulness is sort of packaged for the individual, kind of McDonald's style, Wall Street style mindfulness. And his point was that when you take mindfulness away from spiritual traditions, like in his case, the Buddhist tradition, you often lose the ethics. You lose that sense of being mindful, not just to relieve my stress and deal with my problems, but also to connect me with strangers, both across space and through time. So I think mindfulness has a role to play, as we've been practicing tonight, but it's got to be connected to an ethics of intergenerational justice.
Beautiful. And beautiful. And the last thing is the role of art in actually helping us, I think, to transition towards much more long-term thinking.
I absolutely believe in the power of art. In 1787, a graphic design poster was published in Britain called the Brooks Slave Ship. It showed how many slaves could fit on a ship. It was over 400 of them. This poster went viral in 1787. It was found in churches and pubs and in people's homes, and it helped create the movement against slavery and the slave trade. It wasn't the only thing that mattered. The slave revolts mattered and other things, but it was art playing a role. So now I look around at the world and say, okay, where is the equivalent of the Brooks slave ship? Where are the art projects which can really take our imaginations into another direction and get connected with movements for change? And I love them, you know. There are things like the Future Library, which I talked about. And I think also it's not just the visual arts, but also the novel, the science fiction novel, which goes back to Jules Verne and H.G. Wells in the 19th century. And writers like Kim Stanley Robinson today, or Octavia Butler, are expanding our imaginations into the future. So, you know, there's a long tradition of deep time art going back to the 1830s when geologists started challenging the idea that the earth was just a few thousand years old, like the Bible said, and we need to work more with that kind of art. There's a great artist called Rachel Sussman who's done a project called The Oldest Living Things in the World. It's photographs of living things in the world that are at least 2,000 years old. So she's photographed bristlecone pine trees in California that are over 5,000 years old. I think that starts opening our minds to the kind of conversations that we need.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Roman. Give him a big thank you. And for the people here in Amsterdam, this is not the end yet, but it is the end of this conversation for the people watching at home. So thank you so much for joining us, and have a great evening and weekend. Bye-bye.